Cumbric was a variety of the Common Brittonic language spoken during the early Middle Ages in the Hen Ogledd or Old North in what is now northern England and southern Lowland Scotland. It was closely related to Old Welsh and the other Brittonic languages. Place name evidence suggests Cumbric speakers may have carried it into other parts of northern England as migrants from its core area further north. It may also have been spoken as far south as Pendle and the Yorkshire Dales. Most linguists think that it became extinct in the 12th century, after the incorporation of the semi-independent Kingdom of Strathclyde into the Kingdom of Scotland. Problems with terminology. Dovett Brown sets out the problems with the various terms used to describe the Cumbric language and its speakers. The people seem to have called themselves *Cumbri the same way that the Welsh called themselves Cymru. It is likely that the Welsh and the Cumbric-speaking people of what are now southern Scotland and northern England felt they were actually one ethnic group. Old Irish speakers called them Britons, Bretnic or Bretagne. The Norse called them Bretar. In medieval Latin, the English term Wales and the term Cambri were Latinized as Wallenses of Wales, and respectively Cumbrenses of Cambria. The usual English usage was to call them Welsh. In Scots, a Cumbric speaker seems to have been called Wallace, from the Scots Wallace, Welsh. In Cumbria, a tag region quadam inter Angliam a Scotiam Ceta, Cumbria, a region situated between England and Scotland. The Latin term Cambria is often used for Wales. Nevertheless, the Life of St. Kentigern by Jocelyn of Furness has the following passage. When King Redrick and his people had heard that Kentigern had arrived from Walla into Cambria, from exile into his own country, with great joy and peace both king and people went out to meet him. John T. Koch defines the specifically Cumbric region as the area approximately between the line of the River Mersey and the Forth Clyde Isthmus, but goes on to include evidence from the Wirral Peninsula in his discussion and does not define its easterly extent. Kenneth Jackson describes Cumbric as the Brittonic dialect of Cumberland, Westmoreland, northern Lancashire, and southwest Scotland, and goes on to define the region further as being bound in the north by the Firth of Clyde, in the south by the River Ribble, and in the east by the southern Scottish uplands and the Pennine Ridge. Available evidence. The evidence from Cumbric comes to us almost entirely through secondary sources, since there are no contemporary written records of the language. The majority of evidence comes from place names of the extreme northwest of England and the south of Scotland. Other sources include the personal names of Strathclyde Britons in Scottish, Irish and Anglo-Saxon sources, and a few Cumbric words surviving into the High Middle Ages in southwest Scotland as legal terms. Although the language is long extinct, it is arguable that traces of its vocabulary have persisted into the modern era in the form of counting, scores, and in a handful of dialectal words. For this scanty evidence, little can be deduced about the singular characteristics of Cumbric, not even the name by which its speakers referred to it. What is generally agreed upon by linguists is that Cumbric was a Western Brittonic language closely related to Welsh and, more distantly, to Cornish and Breton. It is believed that around the time of the battle described in the poem Y God Odden, Common Brittonic was transitioning into its daughter languages, Cumbric in North Britain, Old Welsh in Wales, and Southwestern Brittonic, the ancestor of Cornish and Breton. Kenneth Jackson concludes that the majority of changes that transformed British into primitive Welsh belong to the period from the middle of the 5th to the end of the 6th century. This involved syncope and the loss of final syllables. If the poem dates to this time, it would have been written in an early form of Cumbric, the usual name for the Brittonic speech of the Hen Ogledd. Jackson suggested the name primitive Cumbric for the dialect spoken at the time. Place names. Cumbric place names are found in Scotland south of the Firths of Forth and Clyde. Brittonic names north of this line are Pictish. They are also found commonly in the historic county of Cumberland and bordering areas of Northumberland. They are less common in Westmoreland, with some in Lancashire and the adjoining areas of North Yorkshire. As we approach Cheshire, late Brittonic place names are probably better described as being Welsh rather than Cambric, as noted below. However, any clear distinction between Cambric and Welsh is difficult to prove. For references see Armstrong et al., Watson and Jackson. There remain many Brittonic place names in northern England which should not be described as Cumbric because they originate from a period before Brittonic split into its daughter dialects e.g. Welsh, Cornish, Breton and, arguably, Cambric. Some of the principal towns and cities of the region have names of Cumbric origin including Bathgate, West Lothian, meaning Borewood, Carlisle, Cambria, recorded as Lagu Vallium in the Roman period. The word fortis was added later. The Welsh form Caerlwylith is derived by regular sound changes from the Romano-British name Glasgard, Scotland, from words equivalent to Welsh Glasgau, green hollow. Lanark, Lanarkshire, from the equivalent of Welsh Clanark, glade, clearing. Pennycook, Midlothian, from words meaning hill of the cuckoo. Penrith, Cambria, meaning chief ford. There are several supposed Cumbric elements which occur repeatedly in place names of the region. The following table lists some of them according to the modern Welsh equivalent. Some Cambric names have historically been replaced by Gaelic or English equivalents, and in some cases the different forms occur in the historical record. Edinburgh occurs in early Welsh texts as Dynidin and in medieval Scottish records as Dunedin, all meaning Fort of Iden. Falkirk similarly has several alternative medieval forms meaning speckled church, Eglesbrith etc. From Cumbric, Iglesbrec etc. From Gaelic, Falkirk etc. From Scots, Kirkentilic began as a Cumbric name recorded as Caer Pentalic in the 10th century, but was partly replaced by the Gaelic words Cian, head, plus Thulic, hillic later on. Kinneil derives from Gaelic Cian Fhail, head of the wall, but it was recorded by Nennius as Pengwall and by Bede as Penfhail, which appears to be a merger of British and Gaelic. Counting systems. Among the evidence that Cumbric served as a substratum that influenced local English dialects are a group of counting systems, or scores, are recorded in various parts of northern England. Around 100 of these systems have been collected since the 18th century. The scholarly consensus is that these derived from a Brittonic language, closely related to Welsh, though they are often referred to as sheep counting numerals. Most recorded scores were not used to count sheep, but in knitting or for children's games or nursery rhymes. These scores are often suggested to represent a survival from medieval Cumbric, a theory first popularized in the 19th century. However, later scholars came to reject this idea, suggesting instead that the scores were later imports from either Wales or Scotland. But in light of the dearth of evidence for any of these theories, Marcu Philpula, Giuhani Clemona, and Heli Paulasto note that it remains plausible that the counting systems are indeed of Cumbric origin. Scots and English. A number of words occurring in the Scots and Northern English variants of English have been proposed as being of possible Brittonic origin. Ascertaining the real derivation of these words is far from simple, due in part to the similarities between some cognates in the Brittonic and Goidelic languages and the fact that borrowing took place in both directions between these languages. Another difficulty lies with other words which were taken into Old English. As in many cases, it is impossible to tell whether the borrowing is directly from Brittonic or not. The following are possibilities: bark, cowpat, bivaniar, mean fellow, brat, apron. The word is found in Welsh, Scots and Northern English dialects but may be an Old English borrowing from Old Irish. Brogget, a type of mead. Coble, small, flat-bottomed boat. Akin to Welsh subel, a hollow, and Latin corphilus, crag, rocks. Either from Brittonic or Goidelic. Crude, a small boy. Crude, type of small harp. Lum, Scottish word for chimney. Equivalence with Old Welsh. The linguistic term Cambric is defined according to geographical rather than linguistic criteria. That is, it refers to the variety of Brittonic spoken within a particular region of North Britain and implies nothing about that variety except that it was geographically distinct from other varieties. This has led to a discussion about the nature of Cambric and its relationship with other Brittonic languages, in particular with Old Welsh. Linguists appear undecided as to whether Cambric should be considered a separate language, or a dialect of Old Welsh. Koch calls it a dialect but goes on to say that some of the place names in the Cumbric region clearly reflect a developed medieval language, much like Welsh, Cornish or Breton. Jackson also calls it a dialect but points out that to call it PRW would be inaccurate, so clearly views it as distinct in some meaningful respect. It has been suggested that Cambric was more closely aligned to the Pictish language than to Welsh, though there is considerable debate regarding the classification of that language. On the basis of place name evidence, it has also been proposed that all three languages were very similar. The whole question is made more complex because there is no consensus as to whether any principal distinction can be made between languages and dialects. Below, some of the proposed differences between Cambric and Old Welsh are discussed. Retention of Brittonic *RK in Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. The Common Brittonic cluster *RK was spirantized to RX, but a number of place names appear to show Cambric retained the stop in this position. Lanark and Lanarkost are thought to contain the equivalent of Welsh lanage clearing. There is evidence to the contrary, however, including the place names Powermorn and Mornby and the word Gulgen. Jackson concludes that the change of Common Brittonic *RK and GT-RX may have been somewhat later in Cambric. Retention of Brittonic *MB. There is evidence to suggest that the consonant cluster MB remained distinct in Cambric later than the time it was assimilated to in Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. The cluster remains in Old English Cumbraland, land of Cambrians. Crombo Quarter and Crombo Quarter, two 14th-century records of Crummock Water and Crombock, an 1189 record for Crummock Dale in Yorkshire. Cambec, the name of a stream in North Cumbria, recorded as Cambock and believed to be from Common Brittonic *Cambaco, crooked stame. Crimplebeck, Yorkshire, which is said to derive from Common Brittonic *Crumboful, crooked pool. Here the B is assumed to have survived late enough to cause provection. Jackson notes that only in the north does the cluster appear in place names borrowed after circa 600 AD and concludes that it may have been a later dialectal survival here. Syncope. Jackson notes the legal term galnes, equivalent to Welsh galanas, may show syncope of internal syllables to be a feature of Cambric. Further evidence is wanting, however. Devoicing. James mentions that devoicing appears to be a feature of many Cambric place names. Devoicing of word final consonants is a feature of modern Breton and, to an extent, Cornish. Watson notes initial devoicing in Tinnis Castle as an example of this, which can also be seen in the Cornish Tintagel, Din Fort. There is also a significant number of place names which do not support this theory. Devic water and Cumdivic and Derwent all have initial D. The name Calder in fact appears to show a voiced Cumbric consonant where Welsh has calet by provection, which Jackson believes reflects an earlier stage of pronunciation. Jackson also notes that Old English had no internal or final epigram, so would be borrowed with k by sound substitution. This can be seen in names with ck. Loss of with the Cumbric personal names Gospatrick, Gososwald and Gosmungo meaning servant of saint, and the Galloway dialect word Gossick short, dark-haired inhabitant of Wigtonshire apparently show that the Cumbric equivalent of Welsh and Cornish gwas namp bgwaz servant was *goes. Jackson suggests that it may be a survival of the original Proto-Celtic form of the word inno. This idea is disputed by the Dictionary of the Scots language, and the occurrence in Gospatrick's writ of the word wassoners, dependence, thought to be from the same word gwas, is evidence against Jackson's theory. Koch notes that the alternation between gwa and go is common among the Brittonic languages and does not amount to a systematic sound change in any of them. Semantics of pen. In the Book of Aneurin, a poem entitled Hen Ogledd contains a usage of the word pen head that is unique in medieval Welsh literature and may, according to Koch, reflect Cumbric influence. The relevant lines are pan lid dat I even id died gaf pen ywrch pen gwyth pen hyd pen grug yavritho vened pen pysco readed wened translated as, when your father went a mountain he brought a head of buck, head of wild pig, head of stag, head of speckled grouse from mountain, head of fish from falls of Derwent. The formed wened however is at odds with the absence of the ending ydd noted below. Definite article. The modern Brittonic languages have different forms of the definite article: Welsh y, Cornish and Breton and al. These are all taken to derive from an unstressed form of the Common Brittonic demonstrative *sindos, altered by assimilation. Throughout Old Welsh the article is ia, but there is evidence in Cumbric for an article in n alongside one in r. Note the following: Talentire, Cumbria, brow end of the land. Triamain, Cumbria, homestead at the stone. Wymaen, Treels, Lancashire, possibly village of the court. Wylees, but no Treflies, Powers which has no article. Pen Ghent, Yorkshire, hill of the border country. The final element is disputed. Ekwal says it is identical to Kent, which is related to Welsh cant, rim, border, though Mills gives coastal district, or land of the hosts or armies for the county. Trequer, borders, homestead on the River Quer, Wyquer. Pennycook, Midlothian, hill of the cuckoo. Liscard, Wirral Peninsula, possibly Court of the Rock, but also suggested is Irish Leosnar Carriga of identical meaning. Although Koch cites this as an example of Cambric, it lies outside his own definition of the Cumbric region. Absence of ydd. Of all the names of possible Cumbric derivation, few are more certain than Carlisle and Derwent, which can be directly traced back to the Romano-British recorded forms Legu Valium and Derventio. The modern and medieval forms of Carlisle, Caerleoil 1130, and Derwent suggest derivations from br** Leguvulhon and *Derwentho, but the Welsh forms Caerleoilith and Derwenid are derived from alternative forms *Leguvalijon, *Derwentijo, which gave the ydd ending. This appears to show a divergence between Cumbric and Welsh at a relatively early date. If this was an early dialectal variation, it can't be applied as a universal sound law, as the equivalent of Manid mountain occurs in a number of Cumbric names with the spirant intact. e.g. Mindrum from mountain ridge. It might also be noted that medieval Welsh forms of Caerlywlith and Derwennyd both occur in poems of supposed Cumbrian origin whose rhyme and meter would be disrupted if the ending were absent. Use of the name element goes. One particularly distinctive element of Cambric is the repeated use of the element goes occurs in personal names followed by the name of a saint. The practice is reminiscent of Gaelic names such as Maol Colum, Malcolm and Giles Creost, Gilchrist, which have Scottish Gaelic Maol and Giles. The most well-known example of this Cambric naming practice is Gospatrick, which occurs as the name of several notable Anglo-Scottish noblemen in the 11th and 12th centuries. Other examples, standardized from original sources, include Gosmungard, Gososwald and Goscuthbert. Date of extinction. It is impossible to give an exact date of the extinction of Cambric. However, there are some pointers which may give a reasonably accurate estimate. In the mid-11th century, some landowners still bore what appear to be Cambric names. Examples of such landowners are Donegal, Lord of Strathnath and Nithsdale, Moran, Lord of Cardew and Cumdivic near Carlisle, and Ella, Lord of Penrith. There is a village near Carlisle called Cumwittin. This appears to contain the Norman name Quintin. There were no Normans in this area until 1069 at the earliest. In the Battle of the Standard in 1138, the Cumbrians are noted as a separate ethnic group. Given that the material culture was very similar to the Gaelic and Anglian neighbours, it is arguable that what set them apart was still the language. Also, the castle at Castle Carrick, Castell Gerog, dates from around 1160 to 1170. Bar Mali, earlier Bad Ermanach, was given to the church by Malcolm IV of Scotland between 1153 and 1165. A more controversial point is the surname Wallace. It means Welshman. It is possible that all the Wallaces in the Clyde area were medieval immigrants from Wales, but given that the term was also used for local Cambric-speaking Strathclyde Welsh, it seems equally if not more likely that the surname refers to people who were seen as being Welsh due to the Cumbric language. Surnames in Scotland were not inherited before 1200 and not regularly until 1400. William Wallace came from the Renfrew area, itself a Cambric name. Wallace slew the Sheriff of Lanark in 1297. Even if he had inherited the surname from his father, it is possible that the family spoke Cambric within memory in order to be thus named. There are also some historical pointers to a continuing separate ethnic identity. Prior to being crowned King of Scotland in 1124, David I was invested with the title Prince of the Cambrians. William the Lion between 1173 to 1180 made an address to his subjects, identifying the Cumbrians as a separate group. This does not prove that any of them still spoke Cambric at this time. The legal documents in the Lane-Cost Carter Illyry, dating from the late 12th century, show witnesses with Norman French or English names, and no obvious Cambric names. Though these people represent the upper classes, it seems significant that by the late 12th century in the Lane-Cost area, Cambric is not obvious in these personal names. In 1262 in Peebles, jurymen in a legal dispute over peat cutting also have names which mostly appear Norman French or English, but possible exceptions are Gowrie Plutchan, Cokensmith and Robert Gladhock, where Gladhock has the look of an adjective similar to Welsh Gladog equals countryman. In the charters of Wetherell Priory near Carlisle there is a monk called Robert Minnick who appears as a witness to 8 charters dating from around 1260. His name is variously spelled Minic, Minit, Minoc, and it is tempting to see an equivalent of the Welsh Minic, Robert the Monk, here, given that the Anglicisation of the upper classes in general has happened before the Anglicisation of the peasantry in other areas which have given up speaking Celtic languages. It is not implausible that the peasantry continued to speak Cambric for at least a little while after. Around 1200 there is a list of the names of men living in the area of Peebles. Amongst them are Cumbric names such as Gospatrick, servant or follower of St. Patrick; Gosmungard, servant of St. Mungard; Guos Oswald, servant of Oswald of Northumbria; and Goscabracht, servant of Cuthbert. Two of the saints, Oswald and Cuthbert, are from Northumbria, showing influence on Cumbric not found in Welsh. The royal seal of Alexander III of Scotland bore the title Rex Scotorum Britanniarum, or King of Scots and Britons. In 1305 Edward I of England prohibited the leges inter Bretos et Scotos. The term Brets of Britons refers to the native, traditionally Cambric-speaking people of southern Scotland. It seems that Cambric could well have survived into the middle of the 12th century as a community language, and even lasted into the 13th on the tongues of the last remaining speakers. Certain areas seem to be particularly dense in Cambric place names, even down to very minor features. The two most striking of these are around Lanercost east of Carlisle and around Torquant south of Edinburgh. If the 1262 names from Peebles do contain traces of Cambric personal names, then we can imagine Cumbric dying out between 1250 and 1300 at the very latest. In the 2000s, a group of enthusiasts proposed a revival of the Cambric language, and launched a social networking site and a revived Cumbric guidebook to promote it, though this would appear to have met with little success. Writing in Can magazine, Colin Lewis noted that there was disagreement in the group about whether to base revived Cumbric on the surviving sources for the language, or try to reconstruct the form late Cumbric may have taken after the attested period, though his own suggestion was to simply use modern Welsh with its rich literature, culture and history.